Welcome to Trace Evidence, Episode 47, The Abduction of Jodi Huisentruit, Part 2. If you haven't already listened to Part 1, I'd recommend checking out Episode 46, as I'll be picking up a story in progress. 27-year-old Jodi Huisentruit vanished from the parking lot of her apartment complex in Mason City, Iowa, on June 27, 1995. It was quickly determined that Jodi had been abducted. When we last left off, it was 2002, some 7 years after Jodi's disappearance, when a pair of men who both worked in television news decided to take on her case. One of the stories they'd heard about was a sex offender who had allegedly told a court officer that Jodi was dead. This is Trace Evidence, Episode 47, The Abduction of Jodi Huisentruit, Part 2. Peterson and Benson, the two men who had begun looking into Jodi's case, had come across many stories and rumors about her disappearance. One of the few which stood out was based on the experiences of a court officer who had spoken with a criminal, during which time Jodi's name came up. While speaking with a convicted sex offender, the court officer happened to mention Mason City. The sex offender had a two-word response: Jodi Huisentruit. When the court officer dug further and stated that she wasn't sure that Huisentruit was still alive, the man grimly responded, "No, she's dead." His name was Thomas Korskaden. Korskaden, by the time Jodi had vanished, already had a checkered and dark history. In 1975, while serving in the military, he was stationed in California. In California, he was arrested for sexually assaulting a woman, for which he was later convicted. In 1995, just months after Jodi went missing, Korskaden was convicted of fourth-degree criminal sexual conduct. He would later be released, though he would return to prison in 1998 for violating conditions of his release, including but not limited to abusing drugs. Korskaden was released again in 2000, this time after a notification meeting in Austin, Minnesota, at which point residents were told that the sex offender would be coming to town to live after his release. At that time, Korskaden was under heavy supervision and would be required to wear an ankle monitor for the first 6 months of his release. Korskaden would later be arrested and sentenced to serve in Oak Park Heights Maximum Security Prison in March of 2002 on crimes of sexual assault against women and children. According to Mason City investigators, they did look at Korskaden as a possible suspect as early as 1995, but were unable to find anything which linked him to Jodi. Korskaden was reported to have owned a van fitting the description of the one seen in the apartment complex parking lot the morning Jodi vanished. Korskaden's wife also told investigators that he had tried to obtain tickets to attend a television taping at KIMT in early 1995 and had become enraged when he was unable to do so. Korskaden was familiar with Mason City and was known to frequent bars and strip clubs in the area. When asked about the location of his van, Korskaden reportedly told investigators that he gave it away to a friend, but before police could examine it, the van caught on fire. Korskaden claimed to have no knowledge of the fire or how it started. Outside of his disturbing remark about Jodi and a history of violent sex crimes, there's little which investigators felt could link Korskaden to Jodi's disappearance. Mason City police would later obtain a copy of Korskaden's fingerprints, as well as his palm print, which was compared to the print found on the vehicle, though it did not match. In 2004, Lieutenant Ron Vandeveerd was asked if Korskaden had been officially ruled out as a suspect. He replied that he had not, but, quote, "There is nothing that I can see that connects him to the Huisentruit abduction," end quote. In May of 2001, Jodi's family had her declared legally dead. Though they had not given up on Jodi, it seemed necessary to take this step in hopes of handling final legal situations regarding Jodi's life. 7 more years would pass before there would be any new information or leads developed in Jodi's case. In the meantime, her family struggled to accept the possibility that they may never find the truth. Peterson and Benson established a website, findjodi.com, which began as a place to gather all the information and, in the time since, has become a non-profit organization employing multiple people, including former police officers, in hopes of bringing attention to Jodi's case. In June of 2008, 13 years after Jodi vanished, newspapers published a story which included pages from Jodi's journal. This was bizarre, since the journal remained in the possession of the Mason City Police Department. The Iowa Globe-Gazette received an anonymous package in early June of 2008, which contained photocopies of 84 pages of Jodi's journal. When reached for comment, the Mason City Police Department confirmed that the pages were in fact from Jodi's journal and were authentic. The journal included writings from Jodi about her current job. In April of 1995, she wrote, quote, "My number one goal is to get a new job," end quote. On Sunday, June 25th, 2 days before she vanished, her entry reads in part, quote, "Great friends in Mason City, but professionally, I'm fed up. It's difficult finding a new job, and I'm confused about agents and what to do," end quote. When Joanne was reached for comment about the journal, she explained that even she had never seen it, and she later stated, quote, "It's just such a cold case. Somebody knows something, and we wish they'd come forward," end quote. Interestingly, several of the entries made in the days leading up to her disappearance mentioned John Van Cise. On June 11th, she noted John throwing her a surprise birthday party. On June 13th, she discussed attending the Glenn Miller Orchestra with John. On Sunday the 25th, she noted that she had been water skiing, and she mentions Van Cise's son, Trent, giving her tips on how to do it better. Police immediately began an investigation to determine how the journal was leaked to the press. Within 24 hours, they were able to discover the source, the wife of a former Mason City police chief who had since retired. Lieutenant Frank Stearns would later state, quote, "It was one of our retired chief's wife who released that to the media. Why she would release that, I don't know. As a chief of police, he had copies of records for himself, and he must have mistakenly took that when he retired, and his wife took that and released it to the media," end quote. Ultimately, his wife was questioned, but no real motive was determined, nor were they able to establish any links between the former chief or his wife and Huisentruit. After the release of the journal, which investigators felt was damaging to their case, the investigation once again went quiet. Several years later, in 2011, former Mason City police officer Maria All was appealing her termination in a meeting with the Civil Service Commission at City Hall. When her appeal was rejected, All spoke to the media, and for the first time, publicly discussed information she had received in relation to possible police corruption in the disappearance of Jodi Huisentruit. According to All, she had been called to a disturbance at an apartment complex and had responded alongside another officer. While at the apartment, she alleged to have overheard 2 men discussing Jodi's disappearance. and in that discussion, the men named 2 Mason City police officers and an Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation officer. According to all, she had been subject to a great deal of harassment and intimidation, sexism and threats during her time with the Mason City Police Department, which she joined in 2001. She would go on to explain that these experiences only got worse after she began raising questions about Jodi's disappearance. All was ultimately fired from the department in August of 2011, allegedly for not following department rules and procedures regarding possible evidence in a criminal case. The evidence All is alleged to have mishandled hasn't been revealed, but it has been stated it was evidence in the Jodi Huisentruit investigation. Later, a department psychologist ruled that All was not fit for duty. According to All's story, the man at the apartment had alleged that the officers involved in Jodi's disappearance were Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation Bill Basler, along with Mason City police officers Lieutenant Ron Vandeveerd and Lieutenant Frank Stearns. It's important to note that both Stearns and Vandeveerd have played roles in Jodi's investigation over the years, including speaking on television shows and in news articles about the investigation. All 3 denied any possible involvement in the crime and called the claims asinine and nothing more than the ravings of a drunken person. All later stated, quote, "All I want is for the truth to come out. I'm trying to get it out in the open so it won't be a secret anymore." End quote. Details regarding this have been few, outside of the fact that the officers were accused of being involved. Shane Philpott, a pastor in Mason City, and Maria's brother-in-law reported hearing a similar story. In his statements, he has suggested that he was contacted by a pastor, Raymond Tux, located in Minnesota, who informed him that he'd been told by a local, Donald Milks, that the police had been involved in Jodi's disappearance. Milks alleged that he knew the location of Jodi's body, which he had been told by a drug dealer, though he never revealed it. Philpott reported this tip to the Mason City police, though whether or not it was taken seriously is unknown. During the time when Maria was fighting for her job, and also suing the city for her treatment during her time with the Mason City Police Department, she reached out to Gary Peterson at FindJodi.com. Peterson later was able to track down the 2 informants who All had gotten the information from. According to Peterson, by the time he located them, both were deceased. Milks is reported to have died of an overdose, though the medical examiner noted there were no drugs in his system, even though a needle was found in his hand. I've also read accounts where Milks is alleged to have not died of an overdose, but rather as a result of the stress put on his body by years of drug abuse. The other man had been murdered in a stabbing. While some view this as furthering the cover-up, others have suggested that the men were known to hang around other criminals and were not quite upstanding citizens whose words could be considered trustworthy. In October of 2012, over a year after her termination, Maria All was awarded $95,000 in a settlement from Mason City, which put an end to her lawsuit. She maintains that her story about officers being involved is true, and that there's more going on with the Mason City Police Department than they are letting on. But an internal affairs investigation did ultimately clear all 3 officers who were suggested to have been involved. With this information present, but few details available, many have been unsure of where to stand on it. When asked about these accusations, Joanne stated, quote, "Officer All did call me. We had a nice conversation. I do trust the Mason City Police. I want to work with them." End quote. Several more years would pass before much would be stated about Jodi's case. Sadly, in 2014, Jodi's mother passed away, having never learned the truth about what happened to her daughter. It's a fight and a hope which Jodi's sisters now carry, along with her circle of friends and those who loved her. It's their hope that someday the truth will be revealed. Within the past few years, Jodi's case has once again been rising to the surface. In 2015, a former friend of Tony Jackson, the convicted rapist who had been previously examined for allegedly writing a rap song about Jodi, came forward with startling claims. The friend, who elected to remain anonymous, stated that in 1995, after playing basketball with Jackson, he was invited to a local bar with Jackson, who alleged to know that Jodi Huisentruit was a regular. The bar, the South Bridge Lounge, was only a few blocks away, and so the anonymous source claims to have gone along. According to his statements, when they entered the bar, Jackson approached Jodi and began speaking with her. The source says he was too far away to hear the conversation, but that he assumed Jackson was discussing broadcasting with her. Jackson had attended North Iowa Community College, where he had developed an interest in broadcasting and even hosted his own student talk show. This informant thought nothing of it at the time, but says that, in retrospect, quote, "My gut tells me that he probably did it, after all the stuff he's done since." End quote. Another anonymous source claimed, at the time, that she used to often jog back in 1995, and would run past Jodi's apartment along her route every morning between 4 and 5 a.m. According to her statement, she had been jogging by on the morning of June 27th, when, quote, "I'm coming up to the apartment, and a car comes out really fast, and it nearly hits me, and then I have to jump onto the sidewalk, and its headlights were off as it sped away." End quote. This witness alleges that, around the same time the previous day, when she had been jogging by, she witnessed an African-American male riding a bike outside of the complex. She says the man noticed her as she was jogging, and began pedaling toward her, riding his bike right beside her as she ran, which she found strange and disturbing at the time. Regardless of this information, Mason City investigators refuted the claims, stating that they had found no evidence in their investigation which would connect Tony Jackson to Jodi's disappearance. In 2016, Iowa State House of Representatives Representative John Quaker of Sioux County released a blistering article describing his experience as a member of the Iowa State House Public Safety Committee. Quaker described the fact that there was once a cold case investigation team within the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation, but that it had been dissolved due to budgetary restraints. He went on to discuss 4 major cases that got him invested in cold cases. Third on his list was the disappearance of Jodi Huisentruit. According to Quaker, on the 20th anniversary of her disappearance, in 2015, he had attempted to develop a program to draw attention back to the case, part of which included declaring a Jodi Huisentruit Awareness Day. He wanted to involve the Iowa media in this project in hopes of advancing their efforts in regards to all cold cases. He circulated a letter addressed to the city of Mason City, asking them to recognize the 20th anniversary and to solicit help. According to his statements, all 100 representatives signed the letter. He also spoke to one of Jodi's sisters, who encouraged him to bring attention to the case, though the idea of bringing an awareness day specifically just for Jodi was described as tacky and not something which she thought would bring good attention. Quaker would go on to write, quote, "Chief Mike Lashbrook insisted that he did not want the letter to be sent to him or anybody else in Mason City. Mayor Eric Bookmeyer complied and vouched for what a wonderful job the chief had been doing and that he was close to retirement, so he did not need this issue to come before the public and sully his record." End quote. Quaker goes on to allege that he was accused of meddling with the investigation and that the letter was, ultimately, disregarded by Mason City officials. Coiker would also say that the Mason City Police Department had developed new leads in 2008, and that these leads, which are supposed to be sent to the Division of Criminal Investigation, had not been passed on until 2015, some 7 years later. In a discussion with DCI Director Jim Saunders, Coiker was informed that under Iowa law, the DCI may only assist in the investigation and that the Mason City Police Department owns it. When Chief Brinkley took over in 2016, Coiker states that he sent him a registered letter about the case and received no response. In his article, Coiker wrote, quote, "I will simply say the Mason City Police Department seems to have a dubious lack of interest in following up on leads that could shed the light of day on Jodi Huisentruit's disappearance." End quote. Chief Lashbrook responded, saying, quote, "So far, this letter has proven to be an unnecessary distraction for the Mason City Police Department, involving the expense of time and resources. The fact that it receives such a mixed reaction from legislators, the city, the police department, and particularly the family of Jodi Huisentruit makes me question its value. It's unfortunate that those seeking to promote this letter don't respect the wishes of those who have a more personal interest in this tragic event." End quote. Mason City Mayor Eric Bookmeyer also responded, stating, quote, "I concur with Chief Lashbrook. The MCPD is conducting an ongoing investigation and continues to coordinate with other law enforcement agencies. I fully support their position and their plans to respectfully mark the 20th anniversary of this tragic occurrence. Lastly, it was and still is my position that after reviewing the letter, consulting with the MCPD, and the remaining Huisentruit family, that an unintended precedent would likely be set and be considered disrespectful to other victims and their families. I do not believe there is a place for politicians or politics in this investigation." End quote. In February of 2017, in response to revelations in the Jacob Wetterling case, Mason City Police Chief Jeff Brinkley discussed similar possibilities in the 22-year-old disappearance of Jodi Huisentruit. Chief Brinkley stated, quote, "Maybe there will be something similar to the Wetterling case, where it was a matter of a new opportunity to find DNA and match up some of those things that broke." End quote. When asked whether or not there could be similar evidence in Jodi's case, Brinkley responded, quote, "Yes. Yes is the short answer. I think in 22 years in my career, I cannot believe where we've come with science and how we've adapted science to policing." End quote. Just 1 month later, in March of 2017, news was revealed that the Mason City Police Department had sought and received search warrants in relation to the GPS data on 2 vehicles owned by John Van Cise. The warrants were executed on March 20th against Van Cise, now 72 years old and living in Arizona. They were seeking data on a 1999 Honda Civic, as well as a 2013 GMC 1500. Van Cise is listed as the interested party on the warrant, which was under seal. Mason City Chief Brinkley stated, quote, "As you know, we continue to actively work Jodi Huisentruit's missing persons case from June 27, 1995. The search warrant you are referring to is part of our ongoing investigation. We do not have any public comment at this time about the content of the search warrant or the person named in it. We would ask that anyone with information about Jodi's disappearance contact the Mason City Police Department." End quote. It would seem that, for the Mason City Police Department, John Van Cise remains their one and only person of interest. On May 20th, 2018, just a few weeks ago, the Cerro Gordo Sheriff's Department received a 911 call. The caller, who had been out walking dogs, reported the discovery of human remains at a rural location in the 22,000 block of 275th Street in Mason City. Upon arrival and examination, an anthropologist determined that the remains had been in the location for any time between 5 and 15 years, and are thought to belong to a female between the ages of 20 and 45 who is believed to have stood 5'5" to 5'7" tall. At their eldest approximation, being 15 years, that would go back to 2003, a full 8 years after Jodi vanished. However, this didn't stop rumor from spreading that they may in fact be Jodi's remains. The remains were brought to the medical examiner's office for an autopsy, though once the rumor about Jodi began to circulate, officials did state that a forensic odontologist definitely determined that the remains were not Jodi's. On Wednesday, May 30th, the Iowa Public Safety Department released a news briefing which stated that after the autopsy, it was official that the remains did not belong to Jodi. Simultaneously on this day, a billboard campaign was launched by friends, family, and members of FindJodi.com. 4 billboards featuring a photo of Jodi and the message, "Somebody knows something. Is it you?" are being put up all around Mason City to coincide with what would have been Jodi's 50th birthday on June 5th. In an article about the billboards, Josh Benson was contacted and stated, quote, "Someone knows what happened. We have to continue to find ways to reach people. We've never tried billboards before and felt this is a good way to saturate Mason City with our message and reach out to those who may know something." End quote. In a case that has been fraught with accusations of police corruption, cover-ups by city officials, the alleged involvement of 2 convicted rapists, and the intentions of a close friend, the disappearance of Jodi Huisentruit still creates a firestorm of controversy and speculation among investigators, both official and civilian alike. In the absence of solid evidence, multiple theories have been suggested in Jodi's case. The first theory is that Jodi may have been stalked, abducted, and possibly murdered by someone who has never been on the radar of investigators. Her statements in regard to the black truck following her, her desire for self-defense lessons, and the inability of investigators to identify the owner of the palm print found on her vehicle all fuel this possibility. The second theory is that Jodi Huisentruit was abducted and murdered by Tony Jackson, the convicted rapist currently serving a life sentence for 3 rapes committed in 1997. The former Mason City resident is alleged to have written a rap song about Jodi, suggesting that she was dead and buried in the city of Tipton. The third theory points towards Thomas Korskaden, a convicted rapist of women and children with a sadistic personality who has, in the past, allegedly made statements about knowing that Jodi is dead. Korskaden spent time in Mason City in the 90s and, according to his wife at the time, was angered when he was unable to get tickets to a show recorded at KIMT, where Jodi worked. In addition to this, Korskaden is alleged to have driven a similar style van to the one seen in the parking lot that morning. The fourth theory is that Jodi's abduction may have been perpetrated by members of the Mason City Police Department and DCI in some attempt to cover up other crimes, possibly related to the death of Billy Pruin and 2 informants who had spoken to former police officer Maria All. The fifth and final theory is that Jodi may have been abducted and murdered by her friend and neighbor, John Van Cise, against whom the Mason City Police Department executed search warrants as recently as March of 2017. Van Cise's behavior and statements in the days and weeks following Jodi's disappearance have garnered suspicion from both police and civilian investigators alike. The disappearance of Jodi Huisentruit is a complex mystery filled with unsavory characters, accusations of corrupt officials, mysterious actions, and a rich older man who many believe had eyes for his much younger friend. It is all the necessary details to tell a compelling mystery story, except in this case, there isn't a broad-spanning fiction, but the devastating story of a family losing their younger sister, their cousin, their daughter. It's been nearly 23 years since Jodi Huisentruit vanished from the parking lot of her apartment complex, and in all of that time, little, if anything, has broken. The most recent news comes from just last month, when a body was discovered, but proven not to be Jodi's. On the morning of June 27th, Jodi awoke late, answering a phone call from work. She assured her assistant she'd arrive in 20 minutes, as she'd done so many times before. Sometime between then and 5 a.m., Jodi would mysteriously vanish without an explanation. When last seen, Jodi Huisentruit was described as being a Caucasian female with blonde hair and brown eyes. Jodi's ears were pierced at the time. Her clothing at the time of her disappearance is unknown. Jodi was 27 years of age. On June 5th, 2018, Jodi would have turned 50 years old. She has been missing for nearly 23 years. 23 missed birthdays, the expansion of her family, the lives of nieces and nephews, the passing of her mother. These important milestone events for which her absence has always been felt. In that time, her family has struggled to accept the likelihood that they will never see her again. They have been forced to move forward, though they will never forget. Jodi's childhood friend, Amy, stated, quote, "It can be all-consuming, so I've chosen to focus on the parts of Jodi that were life-affirming and the way she wanted to live her life. It was the complete opposite from the way she's remembered now, as this unsolved mystery, this victim. I choose to move forward and focus on the good." End quote. Joanne, Jodi's older sister, cannot accept that after all this time, the truth has never come out. She later said, quote, "Every day, I think about Jodi. You just shake your head and say, I wish we could get this solved."
What do you want in a true crime podcast?
Do you want well-researched material, but an easy-to-follow format?
Do you want a bit of dark humor, but want sensitive topics handled, well, sensitively?
Do you want hosts who are lactose intolerant, but eat macaroni and cheese anyway?
Well, I think you might be looking for us. I'm Rachel.
And I'm Rebecca, and we're the hosts of the true crime podcast, Yours in Murder. And this isn't any old true crime podcast. I have a background in forensic science.
And I have a background in journalism, so we're able to combine our knowledge and bring you interesting new perspectives on cases.
Not that we're all serious. We have a bit of a dark sense of humor.
Just a bit. I mean, we like morbid jokes and cat jokes.
Lots of cat jokes. So if you're looking for something new and a bit out of the ordinary, check out Yours in Murder.
You can find us on all of your favorite podcatchers, as well as iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, and TuneIn.
You can also follow us on Facebook and Twitter, or check out our website at yoursinmurder.net.
We hope to see you soon, and until next time, we are Yours in Murder.
The abduction of Jodi Huisentruit is one of the more disturbing and complicated cases I've covered, with so many different angles, purported people of interest, and theories revolving around it. While not on a major national level, Jodi was, in Mason City, a celebrity. She was well known as the anchor of the morning and afternoon news, and while celebrity can be an incredibly wonderful thing, it can also bring you to a public life from which you can't escape, where you may be exposed to troubled people who can develop obsessions. Jodi experienced this in the form of being followed while jogging, after which she felt the need to take self-defense classes and to learn to protect herself. Unfortunately, on the morning of June 27, 1995, just 3 weeks after her 27th birthday, Jodi was abducted from the parking lot of her apartment complex and never seen again. The beautiful, bright, and talented young woman was only so far down the path she'd set before herself. Her potential seemed nearly unlimited, and most everyone who knew her described her as bubbly, a kind woman who had a strong work ethic and big dreams. Those dreams, though, would never be fully realized. Nearly 23 years later, the investigation continues. The rumors are still percolating, and the debate about who may have been involved, what might have happened, and why has never ended. Amongst all the debate, 5 primary theories have been developed which seem to encompass the general thoughts and assumptions propagated around this incredibly baffling case. The first of these theories suggests that Jodi Huisentruit was abducted by someone who has never been considered by authorities, and perhaps someone Jodi herself had never known. Jodi was known to be late to work, and according to her coworkers, this happened approximately once a week. In the days and weeks after her disappearance, authorities were quick to decide and reveal that her disappearance was believed to be the result of an abduction. During the course of their investigation, certain individuals made statements to the effect that Jodi's abductor or abductors may have watched her, stalked her, and been familiar with her schedule. If this was the case, which it certainly seems likely, as it's hard to imagine someone happening to be in that parking lot at 4:30 a.m. and on impulse making the choice to abduct her, then it isn't hard to imagine that almost anyone could have learned Jodi's routine fairly quickly. She worked at KIMT, and the studio location was easy to find. Knowing her television schedule and that she anchored live news, it wouldn't have been difficult for someone to wait outside of the studio for Jodi to leave. She was hard to miss, especially in her new red Mazda Miata. From that point on, it's a matter of following her home, watching her for several days, and getting a good idea of her comings and goings. One wouldn't necessarily even have needed to go that far, as she was on the news at 6 a.m., so determining that she would likely be traveling to work in the early morning hours wouldn't take a great deal of insight. So, if we are in fact dealing with someone who was a total stranger to Jodi, this person's abilities to map out her drive, her timing, and her behavior wouldn't have been complicated. While we don't hear about it too much, unless it has to do with a hugely popular movie or television star, there have been many occasions upon which an individual has developed an obsession, and in some of those cases, these obsessions have led to violent and aggressive behaviors, including assault, kidnapping, and even murder. There's an interesting psychological perspective on this known as celebrity worship syndrome, in which an individual may develop an unhealthy obsession with a celebrity's professional as well as personal life. There are different facets to this disorder, some of which remain debated among scholars. One listed is simple obsessional, which constitutes for anywhere between 69 to 79% of all stalking cases. Individuals in this classification often have few successful personal relationships, social awkwardness, feelings of worthlessness, and feelings of powerlessness. Interestingly, feelings of self-worth are thought to be the most important, as it's been suggested that the individual's inability to connect with the celebrity may actually decrease their own self-esteem, making their behavior more erratic. Love obsessional covers 20 to 25% of stalking cases, and as the name would suggest, covers individuals who develop what they believe to be a true love obsession with someone they've never met, and they may even believe that they actually have a relationship with the celebrity. We've seen this happen to people such as David Letterman, Mila Kunis, and Halle Berry. People who fall into this category typically suffer from other mental health issues, such as schizophrenia or paranoia. On the other side, erotomanic individuals believe that the person they are stalking is actually in love with them. This label comprises less than 10% of stalking situations and almost always involves someone who is well known in the community or media. Oftentimes, They believe that the celebrity is sending them hidden signals through their films or television shows, but they are less likely to seek out a face-to-face connection with that celebrity. Entertainment social is a label attributed to those who have a low-level obsession, which may result in behaviors such as discussing the celebrity, following them on social media, or doing web searches for them. Typically benign behaviors which do not result in any major confrontations. Intense personal is an intermediate level associated with neuroticism and can be connected to psychotic behaviors. People under this label may believe that a celebrity is their soulmate, that they truly know this person, or that they're meant to meet them. Interestingly, body image again plays a large role in this label, and oftentimes is involved with individuals who have cosmetic surgeries to achieve similar attributes to the celebrity they are worshiping. Finally, there is borderline pathological, which is considered the most severe level of celebrity worship, in which cases you've often seen an individual do something such as spend an exorbitant amount of money to acquire an item that the celebrity has merely touched, such as a letter or a hairbrush. The one common thread throughout all of these different labels is that there is some form or fashion of mental health issue in regard to the individual exhibiting these behaviors, and those issues usually revolve around self-esteem, depression, social anxiety, and in some cases deeper issues, such as schizophrenia, bipolar, or psychosis. The idea that someone may have had an obsession with Jodi, based purely on her celebrity status, is not impossible to imagine, and what lengths that person may have gone to are difficult to determine. But abduction is certainly something which must be considered possible. Of course, Jodi's abduction doesn't necessarily have to revolve around her celebrity status. As was established, Jodi was a very sociable person who had keen skills for making friends and for flirting with men. This isn't to disparage Jodi in any way, as harmless flirtation can be fun and exciting for all parties involved. But some people often take innocent or even playful statements to mean much more than they do. With that said, there is the possibility that someone from Jodi's personal life may have played a role in her disappearance, whether it be a friend, someone she knew casually, a man she had dated off and on, someone she had simply spent time with, or someone she had worked with. Jealousy, desire, anger, all of these have to be taken into consideration. If Jodi had spent her birthday party just a few weeks earlier, dancing with various people, it isn't impossible to imagine one of them could have thought there was more to it than there was. In her journal, Jodi talks about dating. She essentially says that it isn't hard for her to get a man's attention, but that thus far, she'd been unsuccessful at finding one who could either keep her attention or who was interested in something more than a casual situation. Mason City Police did a thorough investigation into almost everyone who could have possibly been able to abduct Jodi that day, and so the idea that someone she dated could have slipped by their radar seems unlikely. But we do have to keep in mind this was 1995. The internet, though beginning to boom, was still very much in its infancy. Dating apps were a decade away and smartphones weren't a consideration. It's certainly possible that Jodi could have met a man out one night, gone on a date or two, and no one knew about it, and that this person could have had any number of issues that could have led to Jodi's disappearance. The toilet seat being found in the upright position in her apartment does suggest the presence of a man, though authorities found nothing else significant, which I am led to believe means there was no evidence of intercourse having taken place. But is it still possible that a man was in her apartment at least the night before? Absolutely. The one detail which, to many, suggests the possibility of a yet unknown suspect is the inability of the Mason City Police to match the palm print found on Jodi's vehicle to anyone. Whether or not the palm print can be 100% ascribed to the abductor is unclear, but the sheer fact that this print was found and hasn't been matched does lead many to wonder if this person is simply not someone who's been considered. While it could have been an obsessive fan, or it could have been someone Jodi had known. It also could have been someone who was passing through the area and saw an opportunity. While the circumstances of this opportunity arising at 4 a.m. on a weekday seems unlikely, it can't be completely ruled out either. Some believe that Jodi's disappearance may have had to do with her investigation into the death of Billy Pruin, which I'll discuss in more detail in a subsequent theory. The possibility of the suspect simply not being known to authorities remains a consideration for many, and perhaps as likely as any other theory. The second theory revolves around convicted rapist Tony Jackson, who was originally linked to this case because he was alleged to have written a rap song in which he referred to dumping a body in the Iowa town of Tipton, and the song was suggested to have been written about Jodi. Who suggested this, and whether or not Jackson himself said anything about it, seems unclear. When this news reached investigators in 1999, they began to look into it. They had conversations with Jackson and began mapping out his life in Mason City around the time Jodi disappeared. It was discovered that he had lived a mere 2 blocks away from KIMT and was 21 years old at the time. Jackson would later be arrested for raping 3 women in 1997, for which he was sentenced to life. Obviously violent and a sexual criminal, it's not difficult to see why his later behavior and proximity to Jodi at the time would make him a probable suspect. In the years following the investigation, several witnesses came forward telling stories that Jackson knew a bar Jodi frequented, that he had spoken to her, and that he himself was interested in broadcasting. While all of these details are interesting, and certainly make it more suspicious, they're based on anonymous accounts which have never been able to be verified. The story about the man going to the bar with Jackson and watching him speak to Jodi is fascinating, though there's no way to know for certain that it really happened. Also, if Jackson were looking at Jodi as a potential victim, would he have gone out of his way to speak to her in a public location in the weeks and months leading up to her attack? When asked about his involvement, Jackson alleged to have never met nor had any conversations with Jodi, and continued on that he played no role in her disappearance. Obviously, it's difficult to take his word about much of anything, but again, there's also nothing which places him in the parking lot of her apartment complex that night. One witness told the story of seeing a young African-American man on a bike in the parking lot, and that the man rode beside her when she jogged by. While this is a creepy and disturbing story, why would Jackson be hanging out in the parking lot on a bike and then expose himself further by riding next to this jogger if his plans were to abduct a well-known person? It's difficult to determine the thoughts and behavior patterns of a clearly troubled individual, but this has never made sense to me. That same jogger alleges that on the day Jodi vanished, a car sped out of the parking lot. So again, if Jackson had a car, why is he previously there on a bike? Also, why did this witness wait so long to come forward? It can't be ruled out, of course, but it also doesn't make a lot of sense. That leads us to the palm print, and Mason City did in fact get Jackson's palm print for comparison, and as far as we know, it did not match. That doesn't necessarily clear his name, but without any solid evidence to connect him to the apartment, Jodi, or the abduction, it's incredibly difficult to view him as anything more than a possibility, but not a great one. Obviously, this is a very disturbed man who has committed heinous crimes, but it also seems odd that he would abduct and likely murder Jodi, and then later de-escalate to rape and allow the victims to survive. Typically, individuals like this do not get better, they get worse. While Jackson certainly should be considered a possibility, and tested and compared to any evidence which may be discovered as technology advances, he can merely be considered a target of speculation and possibility and little more. The third theory points us to a different sex offender, this one being Thomas Korskaden, the man who's alleged to have stated Jodi's name to a court officer and then made the statement that she was dead back in 1996, just a year after the disappearance. While these statements are bizarre and certainly intriguing, It's always seemed unlikely that Korskaden would just openly implicate himself in Jodi's disappearance. Not to a friend, not to a guy at the bar, but to a woman who worked for the court system. Korskaden had spent time in Mason City and was obviously aware of Jodi's case, which doesn't make it all that out of the ordinary that when the city was mentioned, he would think of Jodi. In addition to this, it's so difficult to read a quote out of context with little to support it. While the court officer pushed for more information, all she got in the end was him suggesting that Jodi wasn't alive. I know that this is a scintillating piece of information, especially when spoken by a convicted violent sex offender, but if it were merely a passing comment that he believes she's dead, it doesn't carry a great deal of intrigue or weight. The question becomes whether or not Korskaden may have played a role. His wife at the time made the statement that he tried to get tickets to a show at KIMT, and when he was unable to do so, he was angry. This establishes that he had knowledge of KIMT and likely would be familiar with Jodi, but at the same time, news broadcasts are not shows which supply tickets for a live audience. So it's an interesting angle, and certainly seems to at least suggest that Korskaden knew who Jodi was. But after her disappearance, there were very few people who had been to Mason City or lived nearby that were not familiar with Jodi or her disappearance. One detail which has been told is that Korskaden owned a light-colored van similar to the one witnesses had seen in the parking lot the morning Jodi was taken. Korskaden had since given the van to a friend, but before police could check it out, the van caught on, or was set, on fire. And of course, Korskaden claimed he had nothing to do with it. While I find this to be fascinating, this doesn't necessarily mean that he was linked to Jodi. Korskaden has a long history of sexual assaults and violent acts, and the destruction of the van could have been perpetrated, if indeed he was involved, to cover up evidence of numerous other crimes, rather than Jodi's abduction. Though it definitely is hard to ignore that this man is a violent sexual predator with access to a van that may or may not have been the one in the parking lot that morning. Investigators state they looked into Korskaden thoroughly and were unable to make any links between he and Jodi in 1995, which includes failing to match his prints to the palm print. Korskaden would later admit to multiple rapes and attempted rapes going back for more than 25 years. So one would have to wonder, if he was admitting to his crimes, why would he not admit to Jodi's disappearance if he played a role in it? He seems boastful about his past, and Jodi's case would provide him with a bargaining chip in terms of the location of her remains if he were trying to play the system in his favor. Then again, a lot of sick and sadistic individuals such as Korskaden often like to toy with investigators, as though this means they have some control over them. It's really impossible to determine Korskaden's motives if he was involved, and why he wouldn't share that information later. Of course, his crimes were all rapes and assaults, so perhaps he didn't want to admit what was likely a homicide. While Korskaden is definitely someone who needs to be looked at more thoroughly, and there's a good chance other crimes he perpetrated remain undiscovered, no true connection to Jodi has ever been established, and the Mason City police are fairly certain that he was not involved. Korskaden remains a possibility, but there is little else that can be developed from that possibility. The fourth theory in this case involves the accusations of former Mason City police officer Maria All. This is a complicated path to follow, but essentially, All tells the story of having a difficult time working for the Mason City Police Department. She suggested that she was harassed, insulted, subjected to unnecessary discipline and punishment, and eventually termination. She did sue over these allegations, but the trial never went through as she agreed to a $95,000 settlement, at which point Mason City stated that paying the settlement in no way suggests they have culpability in her allegations. All of that being said, what seemed to truly kick the harassment into high gear, in her opinion, was when she overheard a conversation where a man at an apartment stated that 2 Mason City detectives and a DCI investigator were involved in Jodi's disappearance. The officers, Frank Stearns, Ron Vandeveerd, and Bill Basler, had all played roles in Jodi's investigation. Stearns was, in fact, one of the first investigators inside her apartment and the one who had noted that the toilet seat was in the upright position. The allegations are difficult to examine, though, as all has never revealed a great deal about them, other than the fact that they were suggested to be involved. Why they would have been involved, what their motives were, and other important details remain unknown. One of the men who claimed to have information was Donald Milks, who claimed that he'd heard from a drug dealer that the police were involved in Jodi's disappearance. He would later claim he knew where she was buried, in a conversation with Pastor Raymond Tux in Minnesota. Pastor Tux would later contact Shane Philpott in Mason City after thumbing through the phone book, hoping to find someone in the area that he could direct Milks to. This is where things get complicated. Philpott is Maria All's brother-in-law, and while she alleges that she tried to deliver the information she'd heard at the apartment, and which was corroborated by the story Tux told Philpott, authorities felt that All had shared information with someone and thus tampered with evidence in Jodi Huisentruit's case, which ultimately played a role in her dismissal and later termination. All alleges that the reason she was terminated was because she'd learned of law enforcement's involvement in the disappearance and that when she refused to let it go, they had to get rid of her. Strangely, for police who are alleged to have abducted Jodi Huisentruit for some reason, they apparently only chose to cost All her job. It essentially became a he said, she said sort of situation, but the problem for me is, much of this information came out in 2011 and 2012. It's been 6 to 7 years since then, and no further details or information has been revealed. If indeed there was knowledge of or possible links to police corruption and involvement in this case, it's difficult to imagine why it would still be kept secret. Internal Affairs did conduct an investigation and cleared all of the officers named as possibly being involved, though I am aware that for many, the idea of the police investigating their colleagues doesn't build a great deal of confidence. That being said, none of the men named have ever been involved in anything of this nature, and none have ever been successfully linked to Jodi Huisentruit in a way which suggests culpability or involvement. Milks would later die under what many have called suspicious circumstances, without ever revealing Jodi's location or further information. Whether or not what he knew was legit, or simply the musings of a drug-addled drug dealer who was known to talk negatively about the police, we may never know for sure. Many have developed a large conspiracy around this, believing that the Mason City police murdered Jodi because of her investigation into the death of Billy Pruin, though there are no links that have ever been made there either. Some believe that when Billy's cause of death was set as suicide, this was done as a cover-up effort to protect a killer, rather than sheer laziness and incompetence, and that Jodi may have gained knowledge of who the killer was, with many speculating that it was a name within law enforcement. We really don't know how much, if any at all, Jodi dug into Pruin's death, and if she had discovered something, how law enforcement officials who were alleged to have been involved would have found out about it. While this is all very compelling, there's almost nothing to follow through on besides statements, whispers, and suggestions, but in terms of evidence, this story comes up short, at least for now. While I understand the interest in believing in the more conspiratorial aspect of this angle, there are things about it which bother me. If indeed law enforcement was involved in this, and we're obviously talking about more than one officer, would they really leave behind such a messy scene as to suggest an abduction? Couldn't they have simply made it look like she disappeared? I know that things can get crazy in the moment, but I find it hard to believe that experienced investigators would have done such a sloppy job. Perhaps it's my own skewed perception that they'd be smarter than this, but again, the entire angle is so speculative, it's difficult to know what's heads or tails. That brings us to the article written by John Koiker, in which he alleged that the Mason City Police Department had done such a poor job of investigating, and they were either disinterested in the case or were actively working to sabotage it. While the article is compelling, It's important to note that Quaker wanted to establish an annual Jodi Huisentruit Day to draw attention to her case, something even her own sister wasn't in favor of, and his accusations essentially revolve around a police chief not responding to him. In fact, he was responded to, and essentially told that while they could use more information, it was an active investigation, and they weren't interested in sharing details of their investigation with the public. This, to me, comes across very much as a political debate involving Quaker's frustration and the Mason City Police Department's frustration in return. The only detail which has emerged over the years that is bizarre in relation to the Mason City Police, and which is actually proven, is that the wife of a former chief is the one who leaked Jodi's journal to the press. It's strange that they've never released a reason for this, their investigation into the matter, or what they ultimately thought about it. While it isn't difficult to see a possible conspiracy there, it seems more likely that the woman wanted to share something she knew her husband had in his possession, either to bring attention to the case, or because she had something that people considered juicy gossip. It doesn't appear that there's any links to the investigation, the disappearance of Jodi herself, or the chief and his wife. It also didn't add up to much, as while the release of the journal was frustrating to investigators, there was nothing found within the pages that contained any major important details about possible suspects or the crime itself. The possibility of law enforcement officials being involved, or a cover-up being executed at a high level, isn't an impossibility, but the case has spanned 23 years. Multiple detectives and police chiefs have been involved, and the idea that a small group, back in 1995, committed this crime and somehow managed to keep it covered up for all these years, while new investigators kept coming along, and they never found anything linking to them, seems unlikely. Also, one would imagine that if this was something they were willing to do to a young reporter, it's probably something that would have happened again, before or after. It's certainly a controversial issue, and some have reported that the Mason City Police have been less than cooperative when it comes to drawing attention to this case. But does that necessarily mean corruption and conspiracy? It's difficult to say, but again, pending further information and details, this seems to be a dead end. The final theory in the abduction of Jodi Huisentruit revolves around her close friend and associate, John Van Cise. Almost since day one, Van Cise has been considered a person of interest. From his bizarre behavior in telling investigators that he was the last one to see her alive, to statements from friends who believed Van Cise had romantic interests in Jodi, which she did not reciprocate, Van Cise has become, in many people's eyes, the prime suspect. Beginning with Van Cise himself, he certainly has said some strange things in interviews over the years. Early on, he spoke about how good Jodi made him feel and how easy it was to love her. He even named his boat after her. While this could all be symbolic and simply representative of a loving friend, many have read more into it. According to Van Cise, the night before Jodi vanished, she came to his place to watch the videotape that was shot at her surprise birthday party that he had thrown for her weeks earlier. Of course, under the official timeline, Jodi was driving home at 8 p.m. and made a call from her apartment at 8:24. Van Cise alleges she came over shortly after 8, which doesn't seem to fit with those details unless the videotape itself was merely 5 minutes. He later said she was in good spirits when she left. Certainly enough to draw suspicion from investigators, who later asked Van Cise to submit to a polygraph, which he did. Now, Van Cise alleges that he passed, but Mason City Police have never revealed the results of that test, and their actions in the years since seem to imply that, even if he did pass, they don't necessarily believe he's innocent. We know based on entries from Jodi's journal that she spent time with Van Cise. The weekend before she vanished, she was in Iowa City with him and his son on a water skiing trip. She talks about going to the orchestra with him, and she was seen dancing with him on the night of her birthday, as well as other nights when they'd go out to local bars. Van Cise was described by some as a playboy type, who had a lot of money to throw around and who very much enjoyed the social scene. While he may have had an interest in Jodi, and most men around her at that time did find the beautiful woman difficult to ignore, as far as we've been made publicly aware, their relationship never went beyond platonic friendship. In those journal entries, Jodi makes it clear that her interest in Van Cise was never romantic. That doesn't necessarily mean Van Cise didn't try, though we have no evidence to suggest he ever made a move on her, and nothing she said to friends or wrote in her journal alludes to anything like that happening. So why would Van Cise tell the story about her coming over if maybe she didn't? It doesn't make a great deal of sense, but oftentimes in cases such as these, a suspect will attempt to insinuate him or herself into the investigation. That could be what happened here, or Van Cise could have had a poor recollection of the time that the event took place. Either way, it's difficult to know for sure. The question becomes, if Van Cise did play a role in Jodi's disappearance, why abduct her at 4 a.m. when he obviously had times where he was alone with her and wouldn't need to commit the crime in such a public forum like a parking lot? Being that Jodi often went out with Van Cise, and even took trips with him, he had a multitude of opportunities during which time he could have murdered her if he had planned to. He owned a boat and could have more easily taken her out on it and left no crime scene behind, though that may have left him in a position of having to explain where she went. Ultimately, there's a lot of possibilities here, some for Van Cise's guilt and some against them. I find it difficult to imagine he wasn't compared to the palm print found at the scene, and since he wasn't immediately named a suspect, it seems a safe assumption that he wasn't a match either, even though the print origin remains debated. All of that being said, if Van Cise had been involved, why would he volunteer any information to police that day? It just doesn't make sense, but much of his words and behaviors over the years haven't made sense. We know that in 2017, warrants were issued for the GPS data from 2 of his vehicles, ones which he did not own in 1995. To me, that suggests the possibility that authorities may believe Van Cise could know the location of Jodi's remains, or possibly Jodi herself, and that he may visit there. But it's also important to note that Van Cise has lived in Arizona for years now, so would he be making a drive to Iowa without arousing suspicion, or without thinking he'd get caught? It's hard to say. Mason City Police have listed Van Cise as their only person of interest. Some suggest that this warrant may have come as the result of someone bringing information forward to police, while others have argued that it may simply be another step in the investigation in hopes of establishing evidence or clearing Van Cise out of their line of focus. Unfortunately, without further evidence or information, Van Cise remains the only named person of interest, and there's almost nothing which connects him to the crime. He knew Jodi, may have had an interest in her, spent time around her, and claimed to have seen her the night before she vanished. There's nothing more here, and while I admit that Van Cise's actions and behaviors do arouse suspicions, I don't know the man, and he could act like that with everyone all the time. It's very difficult to analyze someone from such limited information and few, if any, hard facts about his possible role. While Van Cise cannot be ruled out of the investigation, he also at this time cannot be tied to the abduction of Jodi Huisentruit, though it seems that Mason City Police believe he knows more than he is saying. The abduction of Jodi Huisentruit is a highly complicated, multi-layered case filled with theories, accusations, allegations, and speculation. It has everything that would seem to make it the focus of attention and curiosity. A beautiful young woman, talented, driven, career-oriented with a penchant for having fun and dreams of stardom. Law enforcement officials accused of corruption and a cover-up. Convicted criminals alleged to have been involved. Stories about unsolved murders listed as suicides and conspiracies galore. The one thing this case lacks is answers. For 23 years, those who knew and loved Jodi have had to live with the difficult reality that they may never find out what happened, and Jodi may never be discovered. Sadly, Jodi's mother passed away, never knowing what happened to her daughter, never having the ability to truly mourn her, never having a location to visit, to pay her respects, and to feel close to her. In just a few days, on June 5th, it will have been Jodi's 50th birthday. Jodi's been missing for just shy of 23 years, and we draw closer to a time where she will be listed as missing for the same amount of time that she was known to have been alive. Attention for her case has been ramping up in preparation for this solemn occasion, and one can only hope that the new Billboard program and what will likely be a slew of articles and news reports on her case can drum up something new, something to finally reveal the truth of what happened. Until further information can be found, someone confesses, or advances in technology allow for the receipt of new knowledge, the abduction of Jodi Huisentruit remains open, unsolved, and very cold. If you'd like to find more information about the abduction of Jodi Huisentruit, there are many news articles and forums discussing her case. I'd highly recommend the website findjodi.com. Disappeared ran an episode on Jodi's case, though it's somewhat dated and doesn't dig too deep. If you have information about the disappearance of Jodi Huisentruit, please contact the Mason City Police or the FBI. What do you believe happened to Jodi? Email me at traceevidencepod@gmail.com, tweet me at traceevpod, comment in the Facebook group, or leave a message on the website at trace-evidence.com. If you've enjoyed this episode, please rate and review the show on iTunes, Stitcher, or whatever app you're using. For more information about other cases, transcripts, media, and more, please visit our website at trace-evidence.com. I'm going to leave you with a promo for an amazing podcast called Criminology, and I'm sure you must have heard of it by now. I love the expansive information they explore, and their level of detail is highly satisfying. I want to thank you for listening, and I hope you'll join me next week for another unsolved case on the next episode of Trace Evidence.
This is Mike Ferguson.
And this is Mike Morford.
We'd like to invite you to check out Season 2 of our true crime podcast, Criminology, out right now. Season 2 is all about the East Area rapist, Golden State Killer, and we'll be detailing every aspect of these crimes using the actual police reports and files to chronicle this predator's deeds.
In our coverage of this case, you'll hear from survivors of these crimes and from family members of those that didn't survive. We'll also talk to witnesses, experts, and investigators to help tell this story. You can find Criminology on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, or on your favorite podcast app.